Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
Daily it becomes more clear that whomever wins the US presidency, the world is likely to become an even more dangerous place.
Trump dredges ever more dreadful rhetoric and the pettiest of insults and hurls them in every direction, caring nothing about who gets hurt.
Clinton throws the harder stuff, though, ballistic missiles mainly. Her open threat of war on Syria means war on Russia, and so must be accompanied by a barrage of war propaganda against the big bear. Joining us to review where America stands, or maybe falls, is Dr. Tom Adam Davies, a lecturer in American history at Sussex University and author of, among others, the upcoming book, Mainstreaming Black Power. Dr. Tom, thanks for joining us. The conventions are over. The opinion polls put Clinton 10 points ahead. Is the election all over too?
I think, personally, that polls suggest that Clinton is going to head for a fairly, or has a sizable lead over Trump at this point, but I think the election will be far closer than the polls currently suggest. Ultimately, it's going to depend on who gets out on election day.
Yeah.
Will the people who...
differential turnout is going to make a difference, yeah.
It's going to make a huge difference. It's going to make a difference whether those moderate Republicans who are very uneasy about supporting Trump are still unwilling to either not vote or vote for Clinton, whether Bernie Sanders supporters, who many of whom become very disillusioned by his endorsement of Clinton and Clinton's nomination, whether they are prepared to get out and vote for Clinton. Many of them say they won't. It also depends on what happens in kind of key industrial swing states, especially in the Midwest. A lot of disaffected working class, white American people who've bought very heavily into Trump, former Democratic voters in many cases. They're buying into his rhetoric about protecting American jobs, bringing jobs back to the US by transforming American trade deals overseas to protect and, I guess, revive American industry. So there are
angry white men.
In many cases.
And there's a lot of those. If they all turned out, especially given the way they're distributed across the states that you mentioned, particularly in the Midwest, that could really affect the electoral count in the electoral college. One has to say, though, that with the two least popular people in America fighting each other, it seems to me that the thing was wide open for a third-party candidate. And Sanders could have been that candidate. Why didn't he go for that?
I think it's difficult to say. I mean, he caucused the Democrats and has caucused the Democrats for a long time. He's an independent, obviously, but he's worked in and around the framework of the Democratic Party for a very good reason, because it offers huge benefits for him, and it's allowed him to build the political career he has in many cases. It certainly allowed him to get the airtime and the coverage, as it were, to build the campaign that he did. But if you'd said, 6 months ago, would Bernie Sanders be this kind of political phenomenon, no one would have suggested that that was possible. It would have seemed very unlikely. The same, of course, can be said of Trump. So,
does he have any intention of changing from within?
I think he does, because I think he obviously is very committed to a kind of social democratic program of reforms. He is socialist in his outlook in many ways, and many young Americans and people of colour are buying into that, and they like his vision. And I think he wants to reform the Democratic Party, or thinks he can, and there is at least an initial sign that that's going to happen. So one of the biggest, most contentious issues is the superdelegate issue. That Hillary got all the superdelegates, and if superdelegates didn't exist and it was just on a popular vote, state to state, on the Democratic ticket, then actually Sanders may have had a much better chance of pipping her to the post. And as part of this, the outcome of Sanders kind of progressive movement that he's built is the prospect of substantial reform of the superdelegate system. So they've promised to move up to 2%.
Well, let me predict here that if Hillary Clinton becomes the president, Bernie Sanders will never be heard of again, and no changes to superdelegates are going to be worth a row of beans. But that's, I suppose, a side issue. If Clinton wins the presidency, she's already ramping up the rhetoric about finishing off the Syrian regime, implying a decisive American military intervention in the war, bringing it into direct confrontation with Russia. There's an accompanying drumbeat of anti-Russian propaganda trying to link Trump and Russia, Trump and Putin.
Well, Trump speaks very positively about Putin in lots of ways. I think he admires Putin as a kind of strongman leader.
Yes, I'm not sure we can justify a war with Russia on that on that basis. But what are the most likely foreign policy implications of another Clinton presidency?
It's difficult to say. I think certainly there's a very good prospect that America will continue to take the kind of interventionist stance that it has now to support in Syria, to back the rebel movements to dislodge Assad. And I guess that will, in short to medium term, they'll always therefore be in opposition to Putin. But I think you're talking about Clinton here quite deliberately, but Trump, I think it would also be wrong to think that Trump would have any less belligerent approach to the Middle East than Clinton.
No, he might trip over getting out of bed in the night and press the nuclear button inadvertently or in a rage after a fight with his wife or his daughter. I mean, I'm not suggesting that Trump is less dangerous, but just that he's less electable and that Clinton is clearly the favorite to win. Therefore, we have to think of what the impact on the world will be if she does.
Well, I think in that case, I mean, she obviously stands almost. She's the opposite of Trump on many things, right? So she wants to pursue these kind of international trade deals or investor rights deals that Trump is opposing. She will almost certainly try and increase or boost America's place in the world as in a global leader, especially in NATO, and is trying to manage, I guess, Russian ambitions in Europe and elsewhere.
Now, if Trump gets it, leaving aside the dangers of him tripping over and triggering a world war, isn't it the case that he's likely to be more isolationist rather than her ambition to re-establish American hegemony in the world, that Trump will prefer
wants to build walls?
Yeah, withdraw behind walls that he's going to build.
I know, I would disagree on this point, purely because it might seem at face value to be kind of isolationist sense, especially when you're throwing up walls and you're talking about America first. You know, this kind of classic isolationist slogan that he's kind of revived. But ultimately, if you look at this man's record, you know, he says he's been against the war in Iraq and intervention in Libya. Actually, at the time, he supported both the first Iraq war and then intervention in Libya. It's only afterwards, when the actual outcome or it became to be unpopular or was seen obviously not to have been a tremendous success, that he backtracked. He regularly and has repeatedly talked about essentially walking back into Iraq, and he says, look at a map, draw a circle around the oil fields, we'll drop soldiers in there, we'll protect the oil fields, and we'll take the oil. So he has...
Take our oil.
Yeah, no, he says...
Well, as Roosevelt said, it's not America's fault that God put their oil under other people's.
Right.
He's not that different, you're right, in that regard. There is one key difference. Clinton knows that to get people to vote for you, it's best if you don't insult them as an individual and as a class, as a group, as an ethnic minority and so on.
Yeah.
Is Trump just out of control, do you think, or is there some method in this madness?
It's difficult to say, isn't it, because Clinton obeys the accepted traditional rules of political conduct and behaviour, and Trump does not in almost every single respect. But that's also central to his appeal, that he's not the establishment, that he is the opposite, that he doesn't obey the rules, that he doesn't respect people like Clinton or Obama or Paul Ryan or McCain or any of these other kind of establishment figures in either the Democratic or the Republican parties. And also, to talk about the outrageous things he said, there is something very masculinist, white nationalist, white supremacist about this man's appeal. It's not an accident that he said some horrendously misogynistic things about women. The things he said to Megyn Kelly, the Fox News anchor, is just utterly reprehensible. But there'll be people who think that's utterly acceptable, or that's not a problem for them.
And the Black Lives Matters protests are very prominent outside every rally that he is as well.
Yeah, absolutely, because they know what he stands for.
Well, I mean, right at this moment, and you're the expert, but why would a black person vote for him? Why would a Hispanic person vote for him? Why would a Muslim vote for him? Why would an educated Ivy League or East Coast type person vote for him? Are there enough angry, white, undereducated, underemployed, too poor people in America to elect him?
Well, possibly. I mean, possibly.
Depends on the demographic differential turnout too, doesn't it?
It does,
if
absolutely
every
does.
white person votes and only half of the other groups vote, then that could still tilt the difference.
It could. I mean, American elections are almost always close. The electoral college system can make it seem like one candidate was far ahead. I mean, last time Romney and Obama, it seemed like a fairly clear victory for Obama, but actually the actual popular vote was really pretty close. And that is normally the case in American elections. It has been for a long time. Certainly demographic change in America means that white Americans are a far smaller percentage of the population than they were even 40 years ago. So there has been rapid change, and this whole Trump phenomenon is actually really, it's a reflection of that.
Is that going to last? I mean, what becomes of the Republican Party after November if he loses?
That's an excellent question, yeah, because I think, the Republican Party, the difference between the Republicans and Democrats here is the Republican Party got the candidate that it didn't want foisted upon them, and the Democratic Party got the candidate it wanted, but the more popular candidate, you might say, certainly amongst young people, was the candidate, the anti-establishment candidate. But the Republicans now have to embrace this anti-establishment candidate, and the Republican Party seems, with Trump, it's no longer about a set of Republican conservative ideals. It's about one man and a personality, and that's a real change. How long Donald Trump could endure being, if he were elected, how he'd work with people in the Republican Party, given how many bridges he's attempted to burn and how he's insulted so many of them.
And how many prominent Republicans have openly spoken
Well, they
against
stayed
him.
away from the convention, and even some
Bloomberg went to the Democratic convention, right?
Yeah, but no Republican former president turned up. It was, bizarre in that sense, or rather unique, I think, for such a strong, albeit silent show of dissent of the Republican or the GOP elite. But if it's a wrestle for the soul of the Republican Party, well, then they've lost on the evidence of the primaries.
Dr. Tom, thanks very much. Good luck with the new book. Thanks for joining us on the Sputnik.
The US is a state founded upon the genocide of the Native Americans and built upon widespread slavery, followed by a century and a half of apartheid and racial segregation. No wonder it's a mess. It's the slave trade up next. Don't miss it.
Welcome back to Sputnik. Britain grew rich on the slave trade. Not content with invading other people's countries and stealing their things, we started to steal the people themselves, millions of them.
They were chained into the dungeons of boats and sailed across the seas to the New World, recently discovered by Europeans. Miraculous, really. And the slaves were traded by most European countries. But the Netherlands, where I was born, and Britain, where I now live, were the worst offenders, and neither has made amends.
Joining us now to discuss the campaign for those amends is Juliet Lopez from the Emancipation Day Reparations March, which took place in London earlier this week. You've done a fantastic job with this campaign, I've got to say. Just summarize for the viewers, what are the demands of the reparations movement?
The reparations movement and the march are two separate things. The movement is made up of various organisations, and I'm a project manager at one of them, which is the Working Action Group. And the demands of reparations is firstly for the government to address reparations. In all seriousness, it is something that has been on the table for centuries and is now spilling over into generation after generation of people which are here. So what we're looking for is legal reform and political reform, and for the government to acknowledge its responsibility to us from the colonies and the ex-colonies and us here in England with regard to its responsibility for slavery and all the damage and harm that was done as a result of slavery, which still continues today.
There's nothing unusual about such a demand. After all, people still pay, Germany still pays, for example, huge reparations to the State of Israel, which didn't exist at the time of the Holocaust against Jews, against many others also, but 6 million Jews. And nobody bats an eyelid about the need to continue to make reparation for a great crime. Why do you think it's so difficult for people to even listen to the demand for reparations to the descendants of slavery?
I think it's institutional racism. And I also think it's a system of white supremacy and privilege protecting itself. I think those are the main factors. Racism is a disease. It's an awful poison that permeates throughout this society. And I've seen lots of comments recently, which has just even shown me more so that it's something that needs to be addressed within this society. So I feel that the government's approach to it of its own self to reparations is ignorance of not knowing or understanding or not wanting to understand our perception and our experience and continual experiences is just a naivety upon their part. And I think it's an insult, and I think it's racist. Point out racist. That's the way I feel.
When you and I discussed this on the radio, the common reaction from those who weren't impressed by our point of view was that the slaves themselves are all now dead, and the people in the metropolitan countries who are alive today were not alive at the time of slavery. So they say, why should someone who wasn't alive during the slave trade pay reparations to someone who wasn't alive themselves as slaves? What's your stock answer to that?
Stock answer is that we're still suffering the damage now. We suffer it in so many ways. Our families are dysfunctional in many ways because of the inheritance of slavery. For example, my mum was overprotective with me as a child because she was born in Jamaica, so she was born in a colony before independence. So I'm first generation born here. So it's not so far away as what people think. As far as I'm aware, the last instance of slavery actually happened in 1962. So we are still living that experience. When slavery was abolished, not all English people in this country woke up and said, I love black people. That is not the reality. That is not what happened. We still suffer from institutional racism. We still suffer from direct racism and indirect racism. In everything that we do, in employment, we suffer racism. At school, at university, we suffer racism. Going into the shop, you wouldn't have needed a 1965 Race Relations Act if we didn't need permission to go into a shop. You know, this is only 1965. We're in 2016. Things haven't moved on so much that the government can still ignore any kind of dialogue with us as though we don't exist. We're still being treated like animals, like beasts. We're still being picked up on the street by police higher than any other person of any other race. We are still being targeted by the institutions also. And when I say that, when a black man stands in a dock, it's a completely different experience to someone else who stands
Even
in
the
the
Home
dock.
Secretary, now Prime Minister, admitted that on the steps of Downing Street. She didn't explain why she had been the Home Secretary all those years when this was the case, but she said that if you're black, you're going to have a worse experience in the justice system than if you are white, so it was acknowledgement right from the top. We never made amends, never made reparations to the slaves and their descendants, but we did pay those who gave up their slaves. Tell us about that.
Well, this is interesting. As you know, the Emancipation Act 1833. It took 30 years for it to be passed because of the abolitionists. So what I see as now is that anti-reparationists today are the anti-abolitionists of yesterday. So the same families, the same bloodline, the same people that are protecting their privilege, that are protecting and don't want to lose any status as a result of it, are still there today. So from my perspective, I think that we need to address this. I think that there needs to be a dialogue. And I've been saying this for a long time, and it hasn't happened. So I think the slave owners should pay a refund.
Well,
that is what I think.
If you gross it up now to today's prices, they received hundreds of millions of pounds in compensation. David Cameron's family was one of the families that was compensated for having to give up slaves.
Well, as I said in the introduction, the Netherlands, the Dutch, they are, with the Brits, they are the worst offenders. In the Netherlands, they're even very more explicit about it. You may know that the Dutch version of Santa Claus has a black pit along its side, which is obviously a slave, which traces back to the slave. And the word apartheid is Dutch. It stems from the Netherlands. We had my neighbor on the show who is from the Netherlands, and her expertise is in the slave trade of the Dutch. And she has initiated projects in Amsterdam mainly to trace back those slave owners, where you can physically point out this building, this humongous mansion, this is where one of the slave owners lived. And so basically we're literally giving a map to the slave owners. Is that something you want here as well? Is that one of the projects, initiatives that you'd like to see here as well?
Yeah, kind of naming and shaming.
Well, definitely. I mean, just recently 50 million was given to the government, that was given to another group of people to have a museum and also to have an educational institution to trace and to celebrate their history. But no such offer was made to us, and they were assigned someone from the Internal Affairs Department from the government to do so. So I think in all fairness, because obviously there is a sovereignty and there is a relationship and there is a responsibility to us, we are here in England, we were born here in England, and we suffer here in England, that there should be a dialogue about this. There has to be some kind of consultation on this.
And there so isn't.
Definitely.
I mean, in London, there isn't even a museum to the slavery. There is in Liverpool.
There is in
called
Docklands.
that. In Docklands?
In Docklands, there is an exhibition. It's called Sugar and Slavery, but it does not do it justice. We recently filmed.
No, we've got two. We've got two Imperial War museums. We can have one museum which says London, Bristol, Glasgow, Liverpool. All these big buildings, all these big fortunes were made of the blood, sweat, and tears of slaves. And slaves are people kidnapped from their own country,
yes,
torn out of their own culture, out of the arms of their own families, chained like you, put in a boat, and sailed across the seas, which if you survived, you then spent the rest of your life as the property, the physical property of someone else. Doesn't get much worse than that. This is a Holocaust on its own.
It is. It is. And the worst part is that we had to buy back our children. We had to buy our freedom. We have not received an income or a refund from the payments that we had to pay the slave owners to own our own children. We were not given any kind of compensation whatsoever, yet the slave owners, the riches of London, the companies and corporations that still exist today, still have the legacy of that wealth.
You're a great campaigner. Thanks very much for joining us on the Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
So now with both the conventions done and dusted, both parties being very divided, what is next? Charles Quinn says it's all rigged for Hillary Rodham Clinton. The mainstream media supports whatever. And Hillary Rodham Clinton looks for World War III and the military-industrial complex, plus the banks to get a payoff.
Well, that all sounds like a crazed conspiracy theory to me.
About the reparation and whether it's time for the UK to pay up, there was an interesting conversation between Lucien Quincy Senna and Chris saying, why are reparations for Israel considered totally acceptable, but those for black descendants of slaves dismissed outright? To which Chris responds, because there are still people alive who lived through the Holocaust?
Well, not many. And of course, the reparations don't go to the people who suffered in the Holocaust. They go to a political state that was founded after the end of the Second World War. So, Chris, that answer isn't really an answer.
And those are all the tweets for today.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
You can stay in touch with us on social media through Twitter, RT_Sputnik, or on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. Goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.